So this is what your version of the Chemistry of Life worksheet looks like. You're going to be using Cami to complete this worksheet. So you'll use the text box feature and click in the area you want to type and write your answers in that way. Sometimes as I'm going through these, I give you additional thoughts and ideas, and you may want to write those off to the side somewhere. You can do that with a text box, or you can use your drawing tool. I'm going to go through using my key here, and we're going to go through and talk about how to fill this in. So it says using your notes or assigned text, fill in the following tables and fill-ins appropriately. So honestly, the best way for you to go about this is to do this on your own first, to try and fill in what you know, just to test your own knowledge. And then, you know, like pause the video right now, and then you would come back to it and see how you did and fill in the stuff that you couldn't figure out. Okay, so the chemistry of life, the 4 organic compounds. Remember yesterday I said that organic compounds and biomolecules and macromolecules, those are all going to be the same compounds that they're talking about. And what we're talking about are things like carbohydrates, we're talking about proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Those are the 4 organic compounds, and they're big. So that's why they call them macromolecules, because they're big compounds, and they make up all living things. But first, we're going to define some necessary vocabulary terms. So in this next box, we have the prefix mono and poly. The prefix mono means 1. So a word using that prefix, monomer, means a unit of 1. So a 1 of something. And then poly means many, so a polymer means it's got multiple units. Multiple monomers are strung together to make a polymer. All right, so it's important to discuss the chemistry of life, because as we continue to talk about cells, DNA, and cellular respiration, we need to be experts about all of these organic compounds. They're all going to come back into play again. So before we continue, it's important for us to recognize the 6 elements that are found in all living things. And this is where we get that moniker, that chomps, from the video that you may remember. Those 6 of those elements, we've got carbon and hydrogen. These first 2, I think maybe you should circle them and write on the side. These first 2 have to be present in order for you to call it an organic compound. If they're not both there, it's not organic. So carbon and hydrogen have to be present, and you find them in carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. The other ones are also there, but we have oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Okay, so now let's take a look at carbohydrates. The chemical composition of carbohydrates. I'm asking, what are the elements that you find in carbohydrates? Well, we're going to have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in there. What do carbohydrates do for us? They can give us a quick source of energy, and they can be a good source of stored energy. The monomer we talk about is glucose. This is a simple sugar, a very small sugar molecule. And some examples you can add to this list. I just came up with table sugar, pasta, bread, grains, candy. Those are all different types of carbohydrates. Some are smaller, like monomers, like table sugar and the sugar that's in candy. You could add fruit to this list, because fructose is another type of carbohydrate. And then pasta and bread, those are going to be more bigger carbohydrates, more starchy. A drawing, you already have this drawing. This is a drawing of sucrose, so it's a disaccharide. It's got 2 sugars connected. And polymers of carbohydrates, we mentioned starch and glycogen. Starch is a plant stored carbohydrate, and glycogen is stored carbohydrates in animals. We store glycogen, like you can eat a whole big bowl of pasta, and your body doesn't need all that energy right away. So what it does is, after you digest it, it can get converted into glycogen, and it's stored form of glucose, and you store it in you can store it in your muscle tissue. It'll be stored in your liver, and that way your body can use it later when it needs it. Okay, moving on to proteins. The chemical composition of proteins are going to be carbon and hydrogen for sure, and then we have oxygen, nitrogen, and sometimes sulfur. What do proteins do? Proteins are going to be one of the most important macromolecules or organic compounds that we have. They have a ton of functions in our body. These are just some of them. Some of these proteins are going to be hormones, immune system function, cell communication. In order for your cells to know what other cells are doing, proteins are responsible. Movement, like in your muscles, cellular reactions. There's a lot of functions that proteins have. They're really, really important. The monomers that make up proteins are amino acids. So you string a bunch of amino acids together and you get a big giant protein. Some examples of specific proteins, we have insulin, which is a type of a hormone, growth hormone. Enzymes, we're going to do a lot about enzymes and how they are very specific to their function. Antibodies, those are proteins in your immune system that help get rid of pathogens and things that make you sick. Proteins are found in the cell membrane receptors to help with cell communication, or to help identify a cell. Muscles have lots of proteins in them. And the drawing here is a picture of an amino acid, and then we have the polymer. We call it either a protein or a polypeptide. And then moving on to nucleic acids. They're made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Their main function is to store genetic information, and then there's another one that is an energy molecule. The monomers are called nucleotides. Nucleotides, you can even add this here, are made of a sugar, a phosphate, and a base. And we're going to do more on this later, but nucleotides are even made of smaller things, a sugar, a phosphate, and a base. And some examples are DNA, RNA, and a molecule called ATP, and that's going to be our energy molecule. So you could even draw an arrow from the ATP to energy molecule, so you remember that. Here's a drawing of one nucleotide. You can see the nitrogen base, the sugar, and the phosphate. And the polymers, we just call them nucleic acid chains. And our last category are lipids. They are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. Their main function, we can say for long-term energy storage, because these are different types of fats, waterproofing, insulation, and membrane structure, and this is all going on inside organisms. The monomers, these aren't really like small subunits that are the same strung together. This is made a little differently, as you can look at the picture that you have, but it's made with a glycerol and then 3 fatty acid chains. Typically, and they're really long chains of fatty acids. Some examples of lipids are butter, oil, wax. Phospholipids, that's what makes up our membrane structure, so you could draw an arrow there. Lard, which is a type of animal fat. Cuticles on the leaves. If you ever look at water, like when you water your plants at home and the water runs off the leaves, that's because there's a waxy layer on the leaves that's protecting them. And then our drawing, you can see the glycerol is on the left-hand side, and then you have their 3 fatty acid chains. And our polymer, we simply call them lipid chains to identify them that way. So hopefully you did okay when you tried this on your own, but I would definitely add in any additional information that I discussed, and make sure you study this, because this information from these pages will come back multiple times throughout the school year. So this is going to be important to commit to memory.